There comes a moment quiet, almost unnoticeable at first when you stop reaching. Not out of anger, not out of defeat, but out of clarity. And in that moment, something fundamentally shifts in the dynamic between you and the avoidant. Because what you're communicating is no longer, "Why won't you choose me?" but something far more grounded. "I see you and I no longer need anything from you to validate that distinction is everything." Avoidants are often accustomed to a very specific emotional rhythm. People chase, they withdraw. People push, they create distance. It becomes a predictable loop, one that allows them to maintain control while never fully confronting the vulnerability of being truly known. But when you step out of that loop, when you remove the pressure without removing your awareness, you interrupt the entire psychological structure they rely on. And what replaces it is something they rarely encounter: being seen without expectation. To be clear, this isn't about passive observation or silent judgment. It's about a deeper form of recognition. You're no longer trying to decode their behavior in order to change it. You're no longer analyzing every mixed signal, hoping to find reassurance hidden inside inconsistency. Instead, you're acknowledging the full picture: who they are, how they operate, what they avoid, and choosing not to engage with it in the same way. That's what makes it disarming. Because for perhaps the first time, they're not being chased for their potential or pursued for who they could become. They're simply being seen for who they already are. And paradoxically, that can feel safer than any form of closeness they've previously experienced. There's a philosophical layer to this that often goes unnoticed. Most people believe that connection is built through effort, through proving, persuading, persisting. But with avoidance, effort can easily be misinterpreted as pressure. The more you try to bridge the gap, the more they feel the need to widen it. So when you step back, not as a tactic but as a genuine shift in perspective, you're no longer participating in the illusion that connection must be forced. You're allowing it to either exist naturally or not at all. And that level of detachment carries a kind of quiet authority. It says, without words, "I'm not here to convince you of your own feelings. I'm not here to negotiate my worth. I recognize what this is and I'm at peace with it." For an avoidant, that's unfamiliar territory, because now there's no emotional noise to react against, no urgency to escape, no demand to meet, just space, and within that space, reflection. It's important to understand that avoidants don't lack awareness. In many cases, they're highly perceptive. They notice shifts in energy, changes in behavior, the absence of what was once consistent. When you stop chasing but remain emotionally composed, they feel that difference immediately. Not as a loss they can dismiss, but as a presence that has become still. And stillness has a way of revealing things that chaos hides. Suddenly, the dynamic is no longer centered around your pursuit. It's centered around their internal experience. Why does this feel different? Why is there no pressure anymore? Why does their absence feel more noticeable now than when they were constantly there? These are not questions you impose. They are questions that arise naturally when the usual pattern is disrupted. And this is where the real shift begins, not in what you say, but in what you no longer feel compelled to prove. Because when you truly see someone, without needing to change them or extract something from them, you step into a position of psychological independence. You're no longer reacting to their distance as a reflection of your value. You're simply observing it as part of who they are. And that observation, when it's calm and unforced, carries more weight than any argument or emotional appeal ever could. It tells them, "I understand you more than you think and I'm not threatened by that understanding." That's what creates safety. Not the kind of safety that invites immediate closeness, but the kind that lowers defenses over time. The kind that allows them to exist in your awareness without feeling like they're being pulled into something they can't control. And here's the paradox. The less you need from them, the more space they have to confront what they feel. Because now, there's no external pressure to focus on. Only the internal reality they've been avoiding. And that's where your power truly lies, not in pursuit, but in presence. Not in intensity, but in clarity. You don't need to say much. The message is already understood. I see you, and I'm no longer chasing you to be seen in return. There's a subtle but critical shift that happens when your energy moves from pursuit to self-respect. It's not loud, it's not performative, and it doesn't seek validation, but it is unmistakable. Because when you stop chasing and choose to walk away with composure, what you're really saying is something far more powerful than any emotional appeal. I respect myself enough to no longer abandon myself for this connection. And that message lands differently with an avoidant. You have to understand, avoidants are not wired to respond to intensity in the way most people expect. What feels like devotion to you can feel like pressure to them. What feels like persistence can register as intrusion. So the more you tried to prove your value through staying, through fixing, through enduring their inconsistency, the more it reinforced a dynamic where your presence became something they could take for granted or quietly resist. But self-respect interrupts that pattern completely, because now your absence is no longer emotional, it's intentional. There's a philosophical principle at play here. People rarely value what is constantly available without condition. Not because they are malicious, but because the human mind adapts quickly to certainty. When you were always there, always understanding, always forgiving, always reaching, you became predictable. And predictability in an avoidance world often loses emotional weight. But when you step back, not as punishment, not as a strategy, then you see the truth. But as a natural consequence of recognizing your own limits, you introduce something they can't easily categorize. You introduce boundaries. And boundaries, when they are calm and consistent, communicate strength in a way that words never could. They don't argue. They don't explain endlessly. They simply exist. And in doing so, they force the other person to confront a reality they may have been avoiding. That access to you was never unconditional, it was simply unchallenged. Now, something has changed, and that change isn't aggressive. It's not fueled by resentment or the need to prove a point. It's grounded in clarity. You're no longer negotiating with behavior that doesn't align with your emotional standards. You're no longer rationalizing inconsistency as something you need to tolerate in order to maintain connection. You've drawn a line not against them, but for yourself. Avoidants, despite their distance, are highly attuned to shifts in power dynamics. When you reclaim your emotional autonomy, they feel it. Not because you've announced it, but because your behavior no longer revolves around them. You're no longer seeking reassurance, no longer overextending, no longer adjusting your needs to accommodate their comfort. And that's where respect begins to form. Not the kind of respect that comes from admiration, but the kind that comes from recognition. This person is no longer operating from need. And that realization can be deeply unsettling for someone who is used to being the one who dictates the emotional distance in the relationship. Because now, they are no longer in control of the dynamic in the same way. There's also a psychological tension that emerges here. Avoidants often equate closeness with a loss of independence. They pull away to preserve their sense of self. But when you walk away first, when you choose yourself without hostility, you challenge that belief at its core. You're demonstrating that connection doesn't require self-abandonment, that closeness, when it's healthy, includes boundaries, and that you are fully capable of maintaining your identity without needing to hold on to something that isn't reciprocated. That's not just attractive, it's destabilizing in its most productive way, because it forces them to reconsider the narrative they've been operating under. The idea that people will always stay, always tolerate, always adjust. You've shown them a different outcome, one where someone can care deeply, yet still leave when the situation no longer aligns with their values. And that contradiction stays with them. It lingers in the absence you've created. Not as a void filled with anger, but as a space defined by dignity. They may not immediately act on it, and they may not even fully understand it at first. But the impression is there, quietly reshaping how they perceive you and, more importantly, how they perceive themselves in relation to you. Because now, the question is no longer, why are you chasing me? It becomes, why did you stop? And the answer to that question doesn't need to be spoken. It's already embedded in your actions. You stopped because you recognized your worth. You stopped because you refused to compromise your emotional well-being. You stopped because, at some point, staying became a form of self-neglect. And that realization carries weight. Not just for them, but for you. Pray, because this is where the shift becomes permanent. It's no longer about how they respond, or whether they come back, or what they finally realize. It's about the fact that you've redefined your relationship with yourself. You've moved from seeking validation externally to establishing it internally. And once that foundation is in place, everything else becomes secondary, including them. So when you say, without words, I respected myself enough to walk away, what you're really expressing is a standard. A line that, once drawn, cannot be undone without compromising who you've become. And that's the kind of message that doesn't just get noticed, it gets remembered. Because at the end of the day, people may forget what you said. They may reinterpret what happened, but they don't forget how your absence made them reevaluate everything they assumed would always be there. And that is where your power solidifies. You didn't leave to make a point. You left because you finally understood one, there's a common misconception that when you step away, especially from someone avoidant, it must be driven by anger, rejection, or the need to prove a point. But what often goes unrecognized is a far more grounded truth. Sometimes you don't leave because you've stopped caring to leave, because you've started choosing peace. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. When you frame your absence as "you lost me," it invites defensiveness. It positions the dynamic as a failure on their part, something to either deny or rationalize. Avoidants by nature are skilled at creating emotional distance when they feel blamed or cornered. So that framing, while emotionally understandable, rarely leads to reflection. It leads to retreat. But when the message shifts internally and externally to "I chose peace," something entirely different happens. Now, your departure is no longer an accusation. It's a decision, a grounded, self-directed movement towards stability rather than a reaction to their behavior. And that removes the emotional charge that avoidants instinctively resist. It doesn't force them to defend themselves, that invites them to think. Because if you didn't leave out of anger, then why did you leave? That question lingers in a very different way. It's important to understand that avoidants are not immune to loss. In fact, they often feel it deeply, but in delayed, less obvious ways. They're conditioned to suppress, to compartmentalize, to move forward without fully processing what something meant. So when a connection ends in chaos, it's easier for them to dismiss it as incompatible, dramatic, or unsustainable. But when it ends in calm, when it ends with clarity rather than conflict, there's nothing to push against. Me no AD, and that's where the reflection begins. Because your absence doesn't feel like something they escaped. It feels like something they no longer have access to and can't easily explain why. You didn't argue your way out. You didn't demand change. You didn't escalate to force a resolution. You simply recognized that what you were experiencing internally: confusion, inconsistency. Emotional imbalance was no longer aligned with the kind of peace you were committed to maintaining, and you acted accordingly. There's a philosophical depth to this that often goes unnoticed. Peace, in this context, is not passive. It's not avoidance, and it's not detachment for the sake of control. It's an active choice to prioritize emotional coherence over emotional intensity. It's the recognition that not all connections, no matter how meaningful, are sustainable in their current form. And more importantly, it's the understanding that staying in something that disrupts your inner stability is not a form of loyalty, it's a form of self-betrayal. When you begin to operate from that level of awareness, your decisions become less reactive and more intentional. You're no longer trying to fix what feels off. You're no longer negotiating with misalignment. You're simply observing it and choosing not to participate in it. That's what makes your absence feel different. It's not charged with unresolved emotion. It's grounded in resolution. And for an avoidant, that creates a kind of psychological tension they're not used to navigating. Because there's no clear narrative to attach to it. You didn't leave because you were overwhelmed. You didn't leave because you were trying to manipulate an outcome. You left because at some point the connection stopped feeling like peace, and you trusted that feeling enough to act on it. That trust in yourself is what resonates. Not immediately, and not always consciously, but it registers. Because now, the focus subtly shifts back onto them. Not in a confrontational way, but in a reflective one. What was it about this dynamic that led someone to choose peace over staying? What role did I play in that? These are not questions you ask them directly. They are questions that arise when there is no emotional noise left to distract from the truth. And the truth, when it's presented without force, has a way of settling in more deeply. There's also an element of emotional contrast at play here. When someone is used to relationships ending in volatility, your calm departure stands out. It doesn't fit the pattern. It doesn't reinforce their existing beliefs about why things don't work. Instead, it introduces a new possibility, one where the ending wasn't chaotic but conscious. And that can be far more impactful than any argument. Because now, they're not just remembering how it ended. They're questioning why it ended the way it did. And in that questioning, there's space for awareness. Not guaranteed change, not immediate realization, but the kind of internal shift that begins quietly and unfolds over time. Because you didn't force a conclusion, you embodied one. You showed through your actions that peace is not something you negotiate for, it's something you choose. And once you've chosen it consistently and without apology, it becomes the standard by which everything else is measured, including them. So when the message becomes "you didn't lose me, I chose peace," What you're really expressing is a boundary that doesn't need reinforcement, a decision that doesn't require validation, a truth that stands on its own, regardless of how it's received. And that's what gives it weight. Because it's no longer about being understood. It's about being aligned. You're not waiting for them to see your value. You've already acted on it. You're not hoping they'll change. You've already changed your position. And that shift from seeking resolution externally to establishing it internally is what transforms your absence from something temporary into something definitive. Not because it can't be revisited, but because it's no longer rooted in uncertainty. It's rooted in peace. And once you've experienced that kind of clarity, you don't unlearn it. You don't go back to tolerating what once felt acceptable but now feels misaligned. You don't re-enter the same dynamic hoping for a different outcome without a fundamental shift in the foundation. Because you understand at a deeper level that peace is not something you find in someone else. It's something you protect within yourself. And anything that consistently disrupts that is not something you fight to keep. It's something you learn to release. So in the end, your absence doesn't say, "You failed me." It says something far more grounded, far more enduring. I finally stopped failing myself. And then we arrive at a position that, for most people, feels counterintuitive at first, but is ultimately where everything begins to recalibrate. It's the space where you are no longer closed off, no longer reactive, but also no longer waiting. A quiet, grounded stance that communicates something very specific. I'm open, but I'm not waiting. That distinction is subtle, but psychologically it changes everything. Because openness, in its healthy form, is not about availability. It's about receptivity without attachment. It's the ability to acknowledge that connection is still possible, that the door is not locked, but also to recognize that your life is no longer paused in anticipation of someone else walking through it. Avoidants, perhaps more than anyone, are sensitive to pressure disguised as patience. When someone says, "I'll wait for you," it may sound loving on the surface, but underneath, it often carries an unspoken expectation. You will eventually meet me where I am. And for someone who already associates closeness with obligation, that expectation can feel suffocating, even if it's never explicitly stated. But when you shift into "I'm open, but I'm not waiting," you remove that pressure entirely. You're no longer positioning yourself as a constant in the background of their indecision. You're no longer signaling that your timeline is dependent on their readiness. Instead, you're expressing something far more self-assured. If alignment happens, I'll meet it. But I'm not structuring my life around the possibility, and that creates a different kind of emotional environment, one that is not built on urgency, but on choice. From a philosophical standpoint, this is where autonomy becomes fully realized. You're no longer operating from scarcity, where the connection feels like something you might lose if you don't hold on to it tightly. No, you're operating from sufficiency, where your sense of self is intact regardless of the outcome. And that internal shift is what makes your openness feel safe rather than demanding. Because now, there's no hidden agenda, no subtle pull, no expectation that they must act in order to maintain your presence. You're not withdrawing to provoke a reaction, and you're not staying available to guarantee one. You're simply existing in a space where your life continues with or without their participation. For an avoidant, this introduces a form of uncertainty that is fundamentally different from what they're used to. It's not the uncertainty of emotional volatility or unpredictable behavior. It's the uncertainty of no longer being able to assume your availability. And that matters, because when your presence is no longer guaranteed, it forces a shift in perception. You are no longer a fixed point in their emotional landscape. You become a moving variable, someone who can be engaged with, but not indefinitely postponed. And that's where something deeper begins to surface. Avoidants often suppress desire when they feel overwhelmed. They create distance to regulate their internal state, but when the external pressure is removed and replaced with calm, grounded openness, they are left with something they can't easily dismiss. The possibility that the connection could exist, but may not always be accessible. That possibility carries weight. Not because you've emphasized it, but because you've stopped controlling for it. You've allowed it to exist without attaching your identity to its outcome. And in doing so, you've shifted the dynamic from one of pursuit to one of mutual potential. There's also an important psychological contrast here. When you were waiting, even silently, your energy was still oriented toward them. Your decisions, your emotional state, your sense of timing, all subtly influenced by what they might do next. And that orientation, even when unspoken, can be felt. But when you stop waiting, that orientation dissolves. your focus returns to your own life, your own direction, your own sense of movement. And suddenly, the connection is no longer the center of your experience, it becomes one part of a much larger, more stable whole. That shift is what creates both space and gravity at the same time. Space because they are no longer being pulled towards something. Gravity because they begin to feel the absence of that pull in the presence of your independence. And independence, when it's real, is not loud. It doesn't need to announce itself. Point I. It's reflected in consistency, in boundaries, in the quiet continuation of your life without disruption. That's what makes your openness credible, because it's not rooted in hope, it's rooted in stability. You're not open because you're waiting for them to change. You're open because you're no longer closed by past disappointment. You've processed it, you've integrated it, and you've moved forward without carrying the need